The story opens in fragments of memory and silence, as if time itself hesitates before moving forward. The day was meant to be a celebration, rows of young graduates in dark gowns, the rustle of programs, parents craning their necks to spot their children in the sea of faces. A brass band played a triumphant march, and the air was heavy with the smell of cut grass and the faint perfume of summer flowers. For a moment, everything seemed perfect, suspended in the fragile brilliance of youth and accomplishment. Among them was a young woman, stepping across the stage with a smile that was both nervous and radiant, her hands clutching a diploma that symbolized years of effort, sacrifice, and hope. She had written letters to herself about this day, letters about dreams that now seemed close enough to touch. Those letters would later become the only traces of her inner world, artifacts from a life poised between ending and beginning. There is something cinematic in the way her presence lingers in recollection, the tassel shifting against her cheek, the burst of applause when her name was called, the sound of cameras clicking, trying to freeze her at that instant of victory. And yet, as we recount her story, that moment now feels less like a beginning and more like a prelude to vanishing. Her life, which should have stretched into years of discovery, narrowed instead into the final frame that anyone could remember. After the cheers faded and the cap was tossed skyward, she disappeared into an absence that would define not only her own fate but the aching emptiness of those who loved her. The paradox is striking: the louder the applause, the deeper the silence that followed. Within hours, what had been a day of triumph turned into an unresolved riddle. She was last seen leaving the ceremony, carrying a small bag and her scattered belongings. Friends recalled she promised to meet later that night, to celebrate the closing of one chapter and the start of another. But she never arrived. Calls went unanswered. Plans dissolved into worry, then dread. That very same evening, as campus buildings locked their doors and the lawns emptied of celebration, her presence slipped into absence. It is tempting to believe that disappearances happen suddenly, with dramatic gestures or violent ruptures, but often they begin quietly, almost politely, as though the world erases a person in slow increments. First, she was late. Then she was unreachable. Then she was gone. This was the shape of her vanishing, soft at the edges, terrifying in its silence. A young woman who had once stood in the sunlit certainty of her future was swallowed by an unexplainable darkness. Even decades later, when people speak of her, they recall that final day with a strange mixture of beauty and horror. They describe the glow of accomplishment in her eyes, as though she knew something wonderful was waiting. They remember the way she hugged her parents, the warmth in her laugh when friends teased her about finally being free of late-night exams. And then, in the same breath, they remember the quiet terror when she failed to appear again. That duality, joy and sorrow stitched together, has become the essence of her story. The most haunting part of this opening chapter is that it could belong to anyone. Graduation is supposed to mark the threshold of adulthood, the moment when the unknown feels thrilling rather than threatening. But in her case, the unknown swallowed everything. The cap and gown, once symbols of promise, became relics in a box. The applause, once celebratory, now echoes with grief. The letters she wrote in the weeks leading to graduation became more than simple reflections. They are fragments of prophecy, hints of the anxieties and longings that defined her final days. When read now, they feel like whispers from the edge of disappearance, as though she sensed that her story would not unfold in the way she imagined. The audience is left standing at the threshold with her, the sunlit lawn of the graduation ceremony fading into dusk, the sound of footsteps retreating, the quiet pause before her presence disappears entirely. What remains is the unsettling realization that a single day can shift from being the brightest in a person's life to the darkest mystery that will haunt everyone who remembers it. This is where her story begins, not with answers, but with the haunting silence of a life that simply slipped away. She was not just a name in a file or a faded photograph taped to a telephone pole. She was a daughter, a friend, a confidant, and above all, a young woman on the edge of everything she had worked toward. To understand the mystery of her disappearance, one must first understand the brightness of her life. Before the silence, there was laughter. Before the unanswered calls, there were long conversations that stretched into the night. Before she became a question mark in time, she was a vibrant presence who filled rooms with warmth and expectation. Her childhood was often described by family as modest but full of affection. She grew up in a small town where everybody seemed to know one another, the kind of place where the postman asked about your grades and neighbors loaned each other sugar without hesitation. Her parents believed in hard work and encouraged her education, hoping it would carry her beyond the confines of their small community. She was the eldest child, the one expected to set an example for her younger siblings, and she carried that responsibility with grace. In old family stories, she was the one who loved reading beneath a tree in the yard, scribbling her thoughts into notebooks no one else was allowed to touch. Even then, she lived partly in the realm of words, recording her fears and ambitions in handwritten letters and journals. By the time she entered college, she had developed a reputation for being both ambitious and deeply empathetic. Friends remembered how she would listen to their troubles without judgment, always ready with a word of encouragement. Professors admired her diligence. She was not the loudest in the room, but she carried a quiet determination that drew people to her. Letters she wrote during those years reflect a young woman balancing confidence with vulnerability. She dreamed of becoming a writer, of teaching, of traveling, yet at times she confessed fears that she might never live up to the potential others saw in her. These confessions made her more human, more relatable, and more haunting in hindsight. Her friendships were anchored in sincerity. She was the one who remembered birthdays, who slipped notes of encouragement under dorm doors before exams, who sat with friends through heartbreak. Her laughter was described as unguarded, the kind that could disarm even the most serious moods. And yet, in her letters, she sometimes hinted at a loneliness that no one fully recognized at the time. She wrote of standing in crowded rooms and still feeling apart, of watching others move easily through life while she carried questions too heavy to voice. Those words now carry a resonance that chills, as though she had already begun writing herself into the margins of her own story. What made her particularly unforgettable was the way she carried herself at the threshold of adulthood. Graduation was not merely a ceremony for her. It was the culmination of years of effort that her family had sacrificed for. She had taken part-time jobs to help with tuition, endured nights of exhaustion, and still managed to keep her grades high. She believed the future was wide open. The night before commencement, she wrote a letter to herself, never sent, never shared, where she described her excitement about the possibilities ahead. She imagined living in a city, working with people who inspired her, finding love, and building a life beyond what she had always known. That letter, discovered later, is both inspiring and heartbreaking because the dreams captured in ink were left unfulfilled. Her family remembered the smaller details that shaped her, the way she hummed while making coffee in the mornings, her habit of carrying a paperback novel everywhere she went, the ritual of writing long letters to relatives rather than short phone calls. She seemed to believe that writing was a way of preserving the soul, that letters could hold pieces of a person long after they were gone. This belief would later feel eerily prophetic when her own letters became the fragments left behind after her disappearance. She was not flawless. Friends admitted she could be stubborn, unwilling to compromise when she felt deeply about something. She sometimes withdrew when she felt overwhelmed, choosing solitude over confrontation. But even these traits made her real, someone with edges as well as light. She was not an idealized figure but a living, breathing person, trying to navigate the same uncertainties that every young adult faces. Looking back now, those who knew her speak with a reverence that borders on grief. To them, she represents more than just a lost friend or daughter. She embodies the fragility of possibility, the way life can shift from promise to absence without warning. To know her story is to recognize the brilliance she carried and the ache left behind when that brilliance was extinguished too soon. In this way, she is remembered not for her disappearance but for the fullness of her existence before it. The glow in her eyes as she spoke of her future. The tenderness she showed to those around her. The words she wrote that outlived her presence. To paint her only as a missing person would be to erase the richness of who she was. She was not just someone who vanished, she was someone who lived, who dreamed, who loved, and who left an imprint so deep that decades later, people still speak her name with both admiration and sorrow. The weeks after graduation should have been golden, full of long afternoons and uncertain beginnings, but they were laced with a strange mixture of anticipation and unease. She was caught in that liminal space between being a student and becoming something more, an adult expected to carve out a path for herself. Boxes of belongings sat stacked in her room, some marked for storage, some for her new apartment that she never moved into. Photographs from the ceremony were still being developed, glossy images that captured smiles without revealing the shadows already gathering at the edges of her life. Her friends remember those final days vividly. They would sit cross-legged on the dormitory floor or in coffee shops near campus, talking about futures that felt abstract and limitless. Some had jobs lined up in new cities, others were planning summer road trips, and a few confessed to having no plans at all. She fell somewhere in between. She had interviews lined up, opportunities that looked promising, yet there was a trace of hesitation in her words. She seemed excited and nervous in equal measure, aware that every decision from now on carried the weight of permanence. She spoke of wanting to take a short trip before starting work, perhaps a few weeks to travel and write, a gift to herself after years of pushing forward. Those who saw her last described small details that now feel monumental. One friend remembered the way she lingered at the window of her dorm, watching the twilight settle over campus, as if memorizing the scene. Another recalled how she hugged people a little longer than usual, as though goodbyes carried an unfamiliar heaviness. Even her laughter seemed sharper, tinged with a kind of urgency. Nothing in her actions suggested she was running away or planning to vanish, but in hindsight, the ordinary gestures feel like foreshadowing. On the morning she was last seen, she made several phone calls. She spoke briefly with her parents, assuring them she would be home by evening. She called a close friend, promising to meet later for a celebration dinner. Witnesses recalled seeing her carry a small canvas bag, not nearly enough for a trip, more like something one would take for a short outing. There was nothing dramatic or unusual about her movements, nothing to suggest the weight of what would follow. She stepped into the day as countless others did, unaware that each step was being marked in memory as the last known. The hours unfolded in fragments that the investigation would later piece together like shards of broken glass. She stopped at a bookstore, buying a paperback novel. She was seen at a cafe, sipping coffee, jotting notes on scraps of paper. Someone thought they spotted her walking toward the bus stop, but that detail was never confirmed. These glimpses are all we have, fleeting observations that lead nowhere. What haunts those who retrace her steps is the ordinariness of it all. She was not walking into danger as far as anyone could tell. She was simply living her life, until she wasn't. Her final summer was supposed to be one of transition, moving home temporarily, traveling a bit, preparing for the first job of her career. Letters she wrote in those days paint the picture of a young woman deeply reflective about what lay ahead. She spoke about being proud yet fearful, about wanting to carry the best parts of her college self into the next chapter. She confessed to being nervous about losing touch with friends, about becoming someone unrecognizable in the rush of adulthood. Those fears, so common and human, now read with a haunting resonance. They are not just the anxieties of a graduate, they are the last words of someone who would never get the chance to move past them. What stands out most in this period is the contrast, the celebratory atmosphere of freedom colliding with the eerie undertone of something unresolved. Her friends still talk about that contrast, the way laughter seemed to echo strangely, the way plans for the future suddenly stopped mid-sentence when she failed to show up. She was supposed to join them that evening, to toast to beginnings, to raise a glass to possibility. Instead, they sat staring at an empty chair, calling her phone again and again, their excitement dissolving into confusion. The final summer of 1995 should have been remembered as her season of freedom, the bridge between youth and adulthood. Instead, it became a season frozen in memory, a time when joy and dread existed side by side. The days before her disappearance were ordinary, almost painfully so. And that is what makes them unforgettable. Because sometimes the most haunting mysteries begin not with thunder or warning but with the quiet rhythm of everyday life suddenly breaking. The silence began like a crack in the surface of a calm lake, small, almost unnoticeable at first, but quickly widening until it swallowed everything. The evening she was expected home, her parents set the table as they always did. A place was laid out for her, the meal carefully prepared to celebrate her return. At first, when the hours slipped past, they told themselves she was delayed. Perhaps traffic was heavy, perhaps she had stopped to see a friend. These explanations came easily at the beginning, because no one wants to imagine the darker possibilities. But as the night stretched on and the phone remained still, unease crept into their home like a cold draft that could not be shut out. Her mother was the first to notice the strangeness in her absence. This was not a daughter who disappeared without a word. She was considerate, meticulous in her habits, and rarely left anyone worrying. By midnight, the house was quiet except for the ringing of the phone as her parents tried her number again and again. No answer. No voicemail. Just an endless hollow ring. Her father, restless and unsettled, took his car and drove the familiar highway route she should have been on. Each time headlights appeared in the distance, he allowed himself a surge of hope, only to feel it collapse when another stranger's vehicle passed him by. By dawn, hope had shifted into dread. Something was wrong. They filed a missing persons report at the local police station, their voices tight with urgency. The officer at the desk, accustomed to false alarms, tried to reassure them. Young adults sometimes needed space, sometimes forgot to call. But her parents insisted, this was not like her. She was not reckless, not impulsive. Something had happened. The officer eventually relented, filling out the paperwork, entering her name into the system. It was a small act, but it felt like the world itself was admitting she was gone. The town responded with a mixture of disbelief and nervous energy. Word spread quickly, through neighbors, across campus, into coffee shops where her friends had last seen her. At first, it was whispered speculation. Maybe she had taken a trip. Maybe she was with someone new. But as days passed with no trace, the whispers hardened into fear. Flyers were printed with her photograph, taped to telephone poles, pinned to bulletin boards, slipped into the hands of strangers passing by. Her smile looked out from those pages, a smile frozen in time, demanding recognition. Friends described their confusion with aching detail. They remembered waiting for her that night, the way the chair at the restaurant remained empty, their laughter faltering as the hours stretched thin. At first, they joked that she was running late, that she would burst through the door with apologies. When she didn't, the unease grew into panic. They drove the streets, checking familiar haunts, calling anyone who might have seen her. It was as though she had been erased between one moment and the next, leaving no clue to bridge the gap. For the family, the silence was unbearable. Her mother refused to sleep, sitting near the phone, convinced it would ring. Her father paced the house, restless, unable to sit still while his daughter was missing. Each knock at the door jolted them with both dread and desperate hope. Was it news, or another dead end? In those first days, they lived in the grip of contradiction, clinging to the belief that she was alive, while fearing that every passing hour dimmed that possibility. The police began their inquiries with the routine questions. Where was she last seen? Who did she speak to? Did she have enemies? Did she leave willingly? Each question felt like a wound, as though her absence was being dissected under cold fluorescent lights. Friends and family answered as best they could, but their voices cracked under the weight of uncertainty. She was supposed to come home. She was supposed to be safe. That was all they knew. The absence grew heavier with each day. News outlets picked up the story, and soon her face was on television, her name repeated with urgency. The public began to speculate, to offer theories that cut into the family's grief. Some believed she might have left intentionally, seeking freedom. Others whispered darker suspicions. None of it offered comfort. Instead, it magnified the unbearable truth. No one knew where she was. The silence became a presence of its own. Her room remained untouched, her belongings still waiting for her return. The bed she was supposed to sleep in that night remained neatly made, as though preserving the moment she left. Her journals and letters lay on the desk, silent companions to the unanswered questions. Every object seemed to accuse the air itself. Where is she? This was the moment when ordinary life dissolved into nightmare. The girl who had walked across the graduation stage with a future ahead of her was now a missing person, her image part of an unfolding mystery. The transition from joy to dread happened so quickly it seemed impossible to reconcile. One day, applause filled the air. The next, only silence. And in that silence, her family and friends found themselves living in a world where every second mattered, every rumor carried weight, and every knock on the door might bring news they both longed for and feared. The investigation unfolded like a map drawn in disappearing ink, every line leading somewhere, every clue promising direction, and then dissolving into nothing. At first, the police worked with urgency. They combed through her last known movements, piecing together a fragile timeline. Witnesses were interviewed again and again, each retelling slightly different from the last. One barista swore she bought coffee that afternoon. A passerby insisted he saw her near the bus station. A classmate claimed she mentioned travel plans, though couldn't remember where. None of these threads wove into certainty. Each account seemed to contradict another, leaving investigators with a puzzle where pieces refused to fit. Detectives began with a familiar circle: family, friends, acquaintances. Her parents were questioned, their grief mistaken at first for nervousness. Friends were called in, their lives suddenly rearranged into transcripts and signed statements. Did anyone know if she was dating? Was she having problems? Had she spoken of leaving? The questions themselves cut like blades, forcing those who loved her to imagine possibilities they could hardly bear. Every no and every I don't know left the detectives with empty hands. They turned to her belongings. The small canvas bag she carried was never found. Her dorm room revealed no signs of struggle, only the mess of a young woman preparing to move on with her life. Books stacked in uneven towers, half-packed boxes, letters tucked between notebooks. Nothing suggested she had intended to vanish. There were no travel tickets, no hidden plans, no sudden withdrawals from her bank account. If she had left by choice, she left with nothing. Rumors began to ripple across the community, each one more damaging than the last. Some whispered that she had fallen in with the wrong crowd, others that she might have been planning to disappear and start over somewhere new. These speculations made their way into headlines, painting her absence as a decision rather than a mystery. For her family, it was another wound to bear, the suggestion that she had chosen silence over them. Her letters told a different story, one of roots and love, of someone who had no reason to sever ties. Still, rumors are louder than truth in small towns, and soon every stranger at the grocery store seemed to have an opinion on her fate. Detectives chased leads that fizzled as soon as they appeared. A man claimed he had given her a ride that day, but his timeline collapsed under scrutiny. A report of someone matching her description at a bus station in another city was investigated, only to prove mistaken identity. Each dead end left investigators frustrated, the case file growing thicker while answers remained thin. There was no evidence of a crime, but also no evidence of her leaving willingly. She existed in a liminal state, neither lost by choice nor found by force. She was simply gone. The investigation began to fracture under its own weight. New detectives were rotated in, each hoping fresh eyes would spot what others had missed. Cold, fluorescent-lit rooms filled with maps and photographs became the stage for theories. Some believed she had been taken by someone she knew, others leaned toward the possibility of a stranger encounter. Without evidence, every theory held equal weight, and no weight at all. For the family, the official process felt both necessary and unbearable. Each call from the police filled them with hope that dissolved into frustration when the news was the same: no leads, no answers. They participated in searches, handed out flyers, appeared at press conferences, their grief public and raw. The more they pleaded for help, the more they realized the investigation was drifting into the same purgatory as so many other missing person cases, trapped between urgency and futility. The strangest detail, the one that gnawed at investigators for years, was the absence of struggle. Usually, disappearances left traces, disturbed belongings, witnesses, sounds, something. But her vanishing seemed almost deliberate in its silence. As though whatever happened to her unfolded in a pocket of reality where no one else was watching. That eerie emptiness led some detectives to wonder if the case was less about evidence and more about absence itself, an erasure so complete that it defied procedure. As weeks became months, the official tone shifted. Detectives stopped promising quick answers. Press conferences grew shorter. The word ongoing became a placeholder for unsolved. For her family, that shift was devastating. The case was not closed, but it was no longer burning hot. It smoldered in the background, another file in a cabinet full of tragedies. Yet in the shadows of failure, the investigation did leave behind a strange legacy. The unanswered questions themselves became louder than the answers might have been. Who was she planning to meet? Why were her final hours so fragmented, so unclear? Was she being watched, as some of her later letters would suggest? The investigation failed to solve her disappearance, but it succeeded in casting her life into myth, an unfinished story, a case defined not by what was found but by what never surfaced. And so, the blind corners of the investigation became part of her narrative. Each dead end was a reminder of how fragile the line is between knowing and never knowing. Each unanswered call, each unverified sighting, became another shadow cast across her story. The police moved on. The file gathered dust. But for those who loved her, the questions remained, sharp and merciless. If she had not chosen to leave, and if no one saw her taken, then how does someone vanish without a trace? The letters surfaced like messages from another world, tiny fragments of a vanished voice, written in ink long before anyone knew they would become sacred relics. They were tucked in drawers, slipped into the pages of books, sealed in envelopes never sent. Some were written to friends, some to herself, some to people who never even knew they were being addressed. To read them now is to step into the quiet corners of her mind, to feel the pulse of her thoughts as she moved through those final months before disappearing. They are not confessions or answers, not in any clear sense, but they are windows, unfiltered, intimate, and achingly human. The first of these letters was discovered in a small wooden box beneath her bed, wrapped in a silk ribbon. It was addressed to no one, simply titled "To My Future." In it, she wrote about the life she hoped to build, a small apartment filled with books, a job that challenged her, and nights spent talking with people who made her feel understood. She spoke of wanting to travel, to stand at the edge of oceans she had never seen. She described love as something that frightened her, yet something she deeply desired. The words felt alive with hope and vulnerability, and in their softness was the clear portrait of a young woman who believed her story was just beginning. Other letters were more complicated, revealing shades of her personality that those closest to her never saw. In one, addressed to an old friend, she confessed that she sometimes felt invisible despite the closeness of those around her. "I can be in a room full of people and still feel like I'm watching life happen from behind glass," she wrote. "It's not sadness, exactly. It's just that I feel like something is about to change, and I don't know if I'm ready for it." It was a sentence that would echo in the minds of investigators years later, as if she had unknowingly predicted the shift that was coming. Some letters hinted at deeper unease. One, written just weeks before her disappearance, contained a chilling line that no one could ignore. "Lately, I feel like someone is always behind me. I tell myself it's nothing, but I keep looking over my shoulder." There was no explanation, no further detail, and perhaps at the time it meant nothing more than the paranoia that sometimes accompanies adulthood. But now, read in the context of her vanishing, those words feel heavy with possibility. Was it coincidence, or a warning hidden in plain sight? Her letters were not all filled with anxiety. Many were tender, even joyful. She wrote to her younger self, thanking her for holding on through difficult years. She wrote to her parents, describing how much their sacrifices meant to her and how she hoped to make them proud. She wrote to a person she had feelings for but never confessed to, weaving poetry and longing into sentences she never intended anyone to read. These letters, raw and unfiltered, revealed a complexity that official reports and interviews never could. They showed that she was not a one-dimensional figure defined by her disappearance. She was a young woman navigating love, fear, ambition, and self-doubt, just like anyone else. The letters also hinted at decisions she had not yet made. She mentioned considering a spontaneous trip before starting work, perhaps to clear her head. She wrote about places she wanted to see and people she wanted to reconnect with. Investigators pored over these references for leads, but none were specific enough to trace. They were dreams, not itineraries. And yet, even these dreams became evidence, tiny clues that spoke to the state of her mind before she vanished. One of the most haunting discoveries came months after the investigation stalled. A classmate cleaning out an old desk found a sealed envelope addressed simply, "For when I'm gone." It wasn't dated, and no one knows when it was written. Inside, she reflected on the impermanence of life, writing, "Sometimes I wonder how people would remember me if I weren't here. Would they think of my laugh? My stubbornness? Would they read the things I've written and understand me better, or would I still be a mystery?" The words were eerie not because they predicted her disappearance, but because they captured the universal fear of being forgotten. To those who loved her, the letters became more than paper and ink. They were proof that she had existed fully and deeply, that her life was not defined solely by how it ended. They read and reread them, hearing her voice in every sentence, as if she was speaking from across time. Each letter was both comfort and torment. Comfort, because it was a piece of her they could still hold. Torment, because every word reminded them of the countless things she would never say. The police initially treated the letters as potential evidence, cataloging them, analyzing handwriting, searching for hidden messages. But over time, they became something else entirely, emotional artifacts rather than investigative tools. The deeper they read, the more they realized the truth. The letters were not designed to solve the mystery. They were designed to express a life that was never meant to be silenced. And perhaps that is why they matter most. In a story defined by absence, the letters are presence. In a narrative built around vanishing, they are the undeniable proof of existence. They are pieces of her spirit that refuse to disappear, testaments to her humanity that not even time could erase. And as they would later resurface in the most unexpected way, returned by a stranger decades after she vanished, they would become the catalyst for reopening the questions that had long since been left unanswered. By the 7th month after her disappearance, the narrative around her life had fractured into competing versions, each one fragile, each one incomplete. For investigators, this was the stage where possibility turned to speculation, and speculation hardened into rumor. Every voice in her orbit carried a different shade of truth, and each perspective revealed both more of who she was and how much had already slipped away. The official investigation was still technically open, but leads had dried up. Detectives revisited her classmates, professors, and neighbors, combing again through the same testimonies they had already gathered. Some described her as radiant and full of momentum, the kind of person who could walk into a room and draw attention without trying. Others remembered her as quiet, prone to slipping out of gatherings unnoticed, often lost in thought. These contrasting impressions painted her as both intensely present and strangely absent, depending on who was remembering. It was as if her very identity resisted a single version. Her parents became central figures in these months. They moved through their days in a suspended state, alternating between exhaustion and bursts of desperate energy. They held vigils, distributed flyers, wrote letters to newspapers, and begged for any information at press conferences. Her mother often described her daughter in poetic detail, recounting small habits, the way she hummed to herself while studying, how she always carried an old fountain pen in her bag, how she folded her letters into careful thirds. These tender recollections gave the public a sense of intimacy, but they also carried a strange weight. For her parents, the more they described her, the further away she seemed. Memory became both a bridge and a barrier. Friends, meanwhile, tried to hold on to the version of her that existed just before she vanished. They remembered her walking across campus in the spring sunshine, laughing in crowded cafes, scribbling notes in the margins of books. Some remembered her confiding in them, speaking of vague anxieties she couldn't quite name. A few admitted she had seemed restless, even haunted in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. But others rejected this interpretation, insisting she was simply excited about the future. Even among those who loved her most, consensus was impossible. Each recollection became another layer in the growing fog. It was during this stage that rumors began to gain more traction than facts. Some whispered she had left willingly, crafting a new life in secret. Others speculated about shadowy strangers seen near campus, or about letters she had written but never mailed. The most persistent rumor was that she had been planning a spontaneous trip, something she had hinted at in her private writings. The possibility lingered like smoke. Had she simply slipped away, leaving the world behind, or had she been taken before she could explain herself? The lack of evidence allowed both theories to breathe, and in their uncertainty, imagination filled the gaps. The police, facing mounting pressure, began to view the letters found in her belongings not only as personal reflections but as potential clues. They combed through them for codes, searching for names or references that could lead somewhere tangible. But no breakthroughs emerged. The letters spoke of emotions, not destinations. They revealed her inner life but offered no roadmap to her disappearance. Still, to those who read them, there was always the temptation to interpret more than was there, to believe a sentence about fear hinted at a stalker, or a line about change predicted escape. Each interpretation said as much about the reader as it did about her. For the wider community, her absence became a kind of collective mirror. People projected onto her story their own anxieties about growing up, leaving home, or stepping into adulthood unprepared. News outlets leaned into the tragedy of potential, reporting on her as a symbol of the promise of youth interrupted. But beneath the headlines, her friends and family resisted the idea of her as a symbol. To them, she was not a cautionary tale. She was still a daughter, a confidant, a voice they expected to hear again at the other end of the line. As the months dragged on, the investigation lost momentum. Detectives were reassigned. Tips went unreturned. Flyers curled at the edges on lampposts. And yet, for those closest to her, hope refused to collapse. Her parents kept her room exactly as it had been. Friends continued to write her letters, as if she might somehow receive them. Each act of preservation was a refusal to let her story become final. This was also the moment when silence began to weigh heavier than noise. The absence of evidence became more haunting than any discovery could have been. No clothing found, no bank account activity, no credible sightings. Just emptiness. And in that emptiness, the question of identity sharpened. Was she still the young woman with dreams of travel and poetry, or had she already become someone else entirely in the minds of those left behind? The 7th month left everyone in a paradox. They were drowning in words, her letters, their interviews, the endless retellings of who she was, yet starved of the one answer they needed. The multiplicity of her identity became both a comfort and a torment. It allowed her to live on in memory, endlessly refracted, but it also meant no single truth could be claimed. And as the investigation slowed, it was in this unsettled space, between the versions of who she had been and the silence of what she had become, that the mystery began to take on a life larger than the girl herself. The years that followed her disappearance stretched into a kind of suspended silence, a silence that never ended but instead thickened. By the 8th section of her story, the urgency of the first months had drained away, leaving in its place a landscape of cold cases, unanswered phone calls, and newspaper clippings yellowing at the edges. Time became its own character here, reshaping the way people remembered her and reframing the investigation as less of a pursuit and more of a haunting absence. For her parents, those years were a daily negotiation with grief that refused to settle. They lived in a house that had not changed, the walls painted the same pale color she once walked past, her belongings preserved in their places. Her mother often spoke of feeling like she lived in two realities at once, one where her daughter had merely gone away for a long journey, and one where she had been erased entirely. In both, the waiting was endless. The silence was worse than bad news, because it never allowed closure. Her father withdrew into routines, working, fixing things, keeping the yard trimmed, as though tidiness could hold back the chaos that hovered just beyond the walls. Friends scattered in the years after graduation, chasing their own lives across cities and careers, but the memory of her was never far. Reunions became moments of unease, when her name would surface like an unfinished sentence. Old photos would be passed around, her smile frozen in time, and for a moment the room would fall into silence, as if everyone felt the hole she had left. Some friends admitted to dreams where she appeared as she had been, alive, laughing, carrying her books, only for them to wake with the ache of remembering she was gone. The community shifted too. In the first years, her story had been front-page news, a source of speculation and sorrow. But as time moved forward, the headlines moved on. Other stories replaced hers. Yet in certain corners, on bulletin boards and police stations, in online forums as the internet grew, in whispered conversations at late-night diners, her name lingered. She became a figure of unresolved mystery, a local ghost whose story could be summoned with a single mention. The investigation was never formally closed, but it became what detectives call a cold file. Officers changed, priorities shifted, and her case slid into the archive of the unsolved. Still, every so often, there were flickers of hope. A tip from a truck driver who thought he saw her near a highway rest stop. A call from someone who swore they recognized her in a distant city. Each lead brought her parents back into the cycle of hope and despair, waiting for confirmation that never came. The tips were always dead ends, shadows mistaken for substance. And yet, silence does strange things over long years. For some, it hardened into certainty, she was gone, and they would never know why. For others, it became a canvas for imagination, painting her into scenarios of escape, reinvention, or secret survival. People projected onto her the stories they needed to believe. To some, she was a victim, to others, a runaway chasing freedom. Every version was possible, because no version could be disproven. The letters she had left behind grew heavier with time. They became talismans, pulled out in quiet hours by those who had known her, read again and again as though the words might change under different light. Her handwriting, once casual, became sacred. Phrases took on new meanings, especially the ones that spoke of fear, restlessness, or dreams of escape. For her parents, reading them was both a way of hearing her voice again and an unbearable reminder of her absence. For investigators, they were documents filed away in evidence boxes, their ink frozen but their meaning still alive. As the 20th century edged into the new millennium, her story faded from the public stage. Technology advanced, new cases captured attention, and a new generation grew up never knowing her name. But for those who carried her memory, the passage of time only deepened the ache. Her mother once said in an interview, "It isn't the years that hurt, it's the birthdays." Each passing year added a candle that would never be lit, a milestone never reached. Cold cases are not just about missing people, they are about the erosion of certainty. They remind us how fragile memory is, how quickly absence can be normalized. By the time a decade had passed, she was both omnipresent and forgotten. Omnipresent in the minds of her family, forgotten in the noise of the world. And yet, her story was not over. Because silence is never permanent. Sometimes, years later, the past finds a way to knock at the door. Sometimes, evidence resurfaces not through discovery but through human hands, through strangers who unknowingly hold pieces of a puzzle that everyone else has stopped trying to solve. And in this case, after years of emptiness, that silence would be broken, not by the police, not by technology, but by a stranger carrying her lost letters, walking back into the story no one expected to reopen. It began quietly, almost without announcement, the way significant shifts often do. After years of stillness, after decades in which her story existed only in the hearts of those who had loved her, a stranger appeared carrying something unexpected, a bundle of her lost letters. The news did not arrive like thunder. It came instead as a ripple, a whisper passed from one person to another until it spread far enough to reach those who had been waiting in silence for so long. The stranger was not connected to her family, not part of the investigation, not someone who had been watching the case from the shadows. He was an ordinary man, someone who had lived a life far removed from her disappearance. He came forward hesitantly, holding a stack of envelopes tied together with fraying string. He explained that he had found them tucked away in an attic when clearing out the belongings of a relative who had recently passed away. At first, he had thought nothing of them, just old papers, mementos forgotten by time. But as he read the name on the envelopes, a name that still carried weight in local memory, he realized what he held was not just paper. It was a voice. The letters were not exact duplicates of the ones her parents had preserved years earlier. These were different, fragments written to friends she never sent, notes scrawled in moments of vulnerability, even drafts of letters she had clearly meant to finish but never did. The handwriting was unmistakable, curved, deliberate, occasionally rushed when her thoughts outpaced her pen. Some were creased with age, others perfectly preserved, as if they had been hidden away immediately after being written. The discovery was impossible to ignore. When the man reached out to her family, they were stunned. 4 years, they had clung to the few letters left behind, reading them until the ink felt etched into their own memory. Now, suddenly, there were more. The return of her voice after all this time was both a gift and a wound. Her mother described it as like hearing her call from another room. Her father admitted that when he first saw the envelopes, his hands shook so badly he couldn't untie the string. The content of the letters only deepened the mystery. Some were light-hearted, filled with everyday details about her classes, her favorite books, the pressure of interviews and expectations. Others carried a heavier tone, revealing the same unease she had confided in other writings, hints that she felt watched, or that something was shifting in her life beyond her control. One letter in particular stood out. Addressed but never mailed, it contained a line that sent chills through everyone who read it. If anything happens to me, I hope these words will find someone who understands. The police reopened the file, at least briefly, to examine the authenticity and relevance of the new letters. Handwriting experts confirmed they were genuine. But when it came to the question of how they had ended up in a stranger's attic, no clear answers emerged. The relative whose belongings had been stored there was dead. His connection to her was unclear. Was it coincidence? A forgotten acquaintance? Or had someone placed the letters there intentionally, hiding them in plain sight? For the family, the return of the letters meant more than evidence. It meant a chance to hear her voice again, to sit in a room with her words and feel, if only for a moment, as though she had never truly left. Friends described the experience as both breathtaking and unbearable, like being given a photograph of someone you miss, only to realize it was taken the day before they vanished. Every word carried a double weight, what she had meant at the time, and what her absence meant now. The stranger who brought them forward did not linger in the story. He handed them over and stepped back, insisting he only wanted to do what was right. Yet his role became pivotal, because in choosing to act, he broke the silence that had stretched for nearly 2 decades. He reminded everyone that mysteries do not always end with time, that sometimes, time itself becomes part of the revelation. In the public imagination, the return of the letters was electrifying. News outlets that had long forgotten her name suddenly ran features about the ghost letters. Online forums speculated wildly about what they meant. Was she signaling a plan to disappear? Was someone else preserving her words to keep her memory alive? Or were the letters simply misplaced, artifacts of a young life cut short by forces still unknown? The truth remained elusive, but what mattered most was this: after years of absence, her voice had returned. The letters broke the long silence, stirring old grief into new urgency. They reopened wounds, yes, but they also reopened questions. And in that reawakening, her story shifted once again, from a cold case drifting quietly in the shadows to a mystery burning once more in the light. The reappearance of the letters rippled outward like shockwaves, unsettling everyone who had learned to live, however uneasily, with the silence of her absence. For her family, the effect was immediate and overwhelming. 4 years, they had practiced the fragile art of survival, living with an open wound, holding on to small rituals that kept her memory alive. The letters shattered that fragile balance. Suddenly, she was not just a photograph on the wall or a story retold at anniversaries, she was speaking again, through words that had waited in hiding for decades. Her mother described the feeling as a reopening of time. She would sit at the kitchen table with one of the newly found letters laid before her, reading it slowly, lips moving as though to summon her daughter's voice. Sometimes she read them aloud to the empty room, her voice trembling, until it felt like her daughter was just upstairs, about to come down. But each reading carried its own cruel counterweight, the awareness that these words were all that remained. They were a presence that magnified absence, filling the air with her voice while reminding them she was still gone. Her father reacted differently. Where her mother embraced the letters, he feared them. He read them once, carefully, and then tucked them away, as though to limit their power. To him, they were both miracle and torment. He admitted in an interview that the line, "If anything happens to me," kept him awake at night, looping through his mind like a refrain he could not silence. He began pacing the house again, retracing steps he had taken 20 years earlier when he first searched for answers, unable to reconcile that the questions were still unanswered. Friends from her college years gathered again, drawn back into her story by the sudden revival. They held informal meetings, reading the letters together, sharing memories, and trying to decode the tone of her words. Some believed the letters revealed a young woman overwhelmed by transition, her anxieties magnified by the pressure of stepping into adulthood. Others pointed to the unease threaded between her sentences as proof she had been stalked or threatened. Each interpretation said as much about the reader as about her. What bound them together was the ache of recognition, the sense that her voice was alive again, reminding them of how deeply she had mattered. The community, too, felt the stir. For those who had lived in the town during her disappearance, the letters revived a ghost they had long since placed in the shadows. Conversations began again in grocery store aisles, at church gatherings, at local diners late at night. People traded theories, revisited rumors, and confessed how the case had haunted them. Younger generations, who had only heard of her story in fragments, now encountered her words firsthand. They found themselves drawn into the mystery not as distant observers but as participants, inheriting the weight of a story that refused to die. The letters also unsettled the fragile peace of time. For 2 decades, her story had been drifting toward closure, not resolution, but resignation. Families who lose someone often describe a point at which hope transforms into acceptance, when the mind begins to protect itself from endless yearning. The arrival of the letters broke that process.